Well, welcome, Mark. Mark Songer is a court-qualified expert in forensic document examinations. He provides investigations, reports, and testimony towards the resolution of matters involving disputed documents or signatures, including wills, checks, contracts, deeds, account ledgers, medical records, and autograph authentication. And also voting. I saw him on 9 News about voting, teaching those election people how to look at signatures. His other areas of expertise include employment background screening, casino and hotel surveillance systems in operation, proper procedure and protocol in the handling and destruction of classified materials, and the collection, storage, and retention of biometric information. Mark is a former FBI special agent and FBI document analyst, and was the designated handwriting expert for the Evidence Response Team, Los Angeles. During his tenure in the FBI, Mr. Songer instructed numerous law enforcement officers and examiners in handwriting identification, crime scene investigations, and the proper collection of writing samples. He has also developed and implemented criminal justice and forensic science programs at several institutions of higher learning, including the University of California and La Sierra University. In addition, Mark is a former adjunct professor of forensic science at National University, San Diego, and is currently an adjunct professor with Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona Beach, Florida. He's also a lifetime member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. And thank you for your service.
Yeah,
and here we go. And for that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Songer.
So let's see if this works. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay. Does that work? Does everybody see that?
Yep.
Wow, look at that. It's perfectly formatted too. All right. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me. It's really interesting hearing you, some of you guys speak tonight. In particular, referencing Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who, by the way, as you're probably aware of, was the creator of Sherlock Holmes series. I believe that he wrote his first book around 1887, and he was a really interesting guy. He was a writer, and he was also a physician, and of course, I think somebody mentioned it, a spiritualist. So, when I first started my forensics program at the university, we actually discussed him quite a bit. He had a very significant part in really establishing or gaining awareness of modern forensic science as we know today. And he's kind of like, he wrote about things that, like fingerprints and, be able to identify certain things based on comparisons. I mean, he was really ahead of his time. And so, it was really his writings and, his readership, the people that were reading the stories, that really forensic science started to flourish, especially around that time period. And it was around around the 1930s, at least here in America, that forensic science started taking a real foothold in terms of being utilized in crime scene investigations, with the one of the first labs being that of the FBI. But I just thought it was really interesting that some of you guys have brought that up. And like I said, he's very instrumental in what we know as forensic science today. I just literally, as Lori indicated, I just finished up weeks and weeks and weeks of training for various states and counties for our in-signature verification for different jurisdictions. In that program, which this slideshow is basically part of, I basically teach these signature verifiers some of the fundamental basic skills of what I do as a handwriting expert. And what we'll cover today are some of those aspects, the scientific methodology that I follow, and then we'll follow it up with I thought I'd treat you guys to doing a case analysis on the Tiger King. Not sure how many of you have watched the Netflix series, but I had a little portion of that in terms of conducting the analysis on the Don Lewis writings, and I'll show you my my presentation I did for that one, which was recently. So like Lori said, I've been doing this for a long time, 25 years as a handwriting expert. I am a former special agent and also a FBI scientist. I actually started my career in the FBI laboratory in the question document section. And then from there, I gravitated towards Los Angeles, where I was assigned to white collar crimes, foreign counterintelligence work, and domestic terrorism issues. I've been accepted just about every state in America in a variety of different, matters, criminal, civil, and military as well. I do have an extensive practice, a nationwide practice, not only nationwide, but also international. And I have many cases internationally as well. So those become really interesting because no two courts are ever similar, especially European or cases in the Far East. They all have their different customs, and it's really interesting to see how the judicial system actually works in those particular countries. I find that really fascinating. I belong to several organizations. The Charter Society of Forensic Science is actually a UK-based organization. I'm part of their forensic science community there. The International Association of Identification, which is the oldest forensics group in the world. If you guys are ever interested in finding more about that, just Google it. But in that organization, they cover things like question documents, fingerprints, shoe print and tire tread analysis, which by the way, I conduct as well. And I'll tell you why. A lot of people are like, oh, you go from handwriting to, analyzing shoe prints and, tire tread examinations. Well, shoe prints and handwriting are both what we call pattern recognition disciplines. So it's basically looking at these patterns and determining if there are consistent patterns or writing features, or they're inconsistent. So it's a side-by-side comparisons of these items, and you're trying to determine if they are either authentic in terms of writing or in terms of treadwear or footwear patterns, if they're consistent with the suspect shoe print. So those disciplines are sort of unique and similar to one another in terms of the scientific methodology that's applied. It's basically the same. It's just two different types of materials that you're looking at. So let's go on here. So this is a funny slide. Not many clues, but we did find this fingerprint, and that's really interesting. Sometimes the evidence is right in front of you, and as a handwriting expert, it is right in front of you. You just have to extract the characteristics right in the writing, all the subtle characteristics of that person's writing, and establish that person's variation, and then compare that set of data with the question writings, and then come to some kind of opinion as to whether those signatures are consistent or inconsistent. So it's there, you just have to find it. And sometimes that's a very difficult, that's a very difficult thing to do. In some cases, we don't have all the answers, right? There's a lot of cases that I have done where, my findings have been inconclusive. You just can't tell. And there's a variety of reasons for that, which I'll discuss later. But, one of those things is, lack of, a sufficient quantity of comparable materials. You've got to have materials that are comparable in nature to compare with. You have to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. Comparing an apple to an orange or an orange after an apple, is almost impossible, to do. So, that's one of the limitations. We have many limitations, but that's just one of them. And I'll cover that as we go through this slideshow. All right. Let's see if this works. One of the things I really wanted to cover first is this form blindness test. And this is a really interesting thing. And you guys could actually, if you guys wanted to take this, I have the answers right here. But what it is there's each one of these Yorks. There's 64, there's 32 pairs of Yorks in here. So for instance, this York number 1 corresponds to the number 5 York in there. So each one of them has a pair. Now they're not exactly alike, meaning that they're not identical with one another, but they are consistent with having been prepared by the same writer. So I actually give this test to our signature verification judges because it's rather important that if they're going to be conducting analysis, and for myself included, this was actually the first test I actually took when I went into the FBI. You have to be able to see, right? You have to be able to distinguish shapes, sizes, line quality. And if you can't do that, you really have no business comparing things, right? Especially signatures. So I give this form blindness test, and it's really, it's not a pass or fail thing, but I could tell you that, when I was in the FBI, you pretty much had to score 100% on it in about 30 minutes. Most people struggle with this. Like I said, I've given this test many times, including this year's election judges. Some do well, and then some just bomb it. The ones that do bomb it, they're given some remedial training just to ensure that they're not, blind to form. So this test is rather important, and it's a test that was actually developed in the early 30s by an individual by the name of Albert Osborne, who is regarded as the father of modern question documents. And he came up with this test after having an experience in a court where a judge actually had form blindness, and he couldn't distinguish. It was a bench trial, and he was basically, going to render a verdict, but he literally could not distinguish the shapes and the forms of the writings. And Mr. Osborne recognized that, right, and called him on it. And as a result, the form blindness test was developed. So it's a rather important test in forensic document examinations today. Okay. So basically, people ask me, well, what is a document? Well, a document is anything that could be defined as anything written, copied, or reproduced that conveys a meaning or message. And this could be on literally any medium. I've had writings, not only on paper, I've had them on walls, I've had them on floors, on cars, on windows, and on human bodies. As a matter of fact, what you see there is an actual case I did in Alaska, where this individual parked in front of a school, was going to pick up his child, and decided, was found, dead, right, self-inflicted gunshot wound, and as they were doing their investigation, they came up with these 3 letters, DNR, which stands for do not resuscitate. The family struggled to believe that their son had just killed himself. So they had hired me to determine if the DNR was actually prepared by him. So normally, when you get very limited amounts of writing like that, there's really, that would be a limitation. And there's really nothing you could do about it. But if you start looking at the letters, right, even though it's on human skin, it does have some uniqueness to it, right? That might be identifiable if I was provided a sufficient quantity of this person's known writings, in which they did. And so I conducted my comparison, and I opined to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that that this individual did indeed author the DNR. He wrote it on his arm. So we had that, and also the medical examiner's office conducted what's called I'm not sure if you guys ever heard about this, but it's a psychological autopsy, and it's usually conducted on things of this nature, usually suicides, in which they actually determine, going through the person's personal history, records, medical records, and determine if they had, anything going on in their life that could have caused them to commit suicide. And apparently he did. He had a lot of things going on. He was going through a divorce, had some financial issues and problems. The medical examiner actually also concluded, and also based on the gunshot wound, that this person did indeed kill himself. So coupled with that evidence, along with my analysis, we were able to say that it was more likely that he had committed suicide. So some of the things I do, the brunt of what I do is examine documents, writings, to determine whether a person, wrote it or didn't write it. 95% of those types of cases I do. A lot of those involve contested wills, business agreements, contracts, deeds of trust, and a high percentage of those are actually family member on family member. When it involves money, usually everybody comes out of the woodworks, and and the game begins. So I do a lot of those types of cases, but I also do other types of cases. As you can see here, I have some obliterated writing here, right? These two cases are rather unique. I have one there with the obliterated writing. And on the right of it, you can see that with the use of special equipment, in this case, which is called a video spectral comparator, which is able to separate certain ink compositions from one another if they're different. Here we have an obliteration, and then what we have underneath that obliteration is the number 2. That's conducted with, and I could tell just by the lighting, which is called infrared lighting. On the other side of the spectrum, we also have ultraviolet lighting, which reacts differently based on the excitation of light as it hits the object and is reflected back. That's how we're able to decipher obliterations and overwritings if they come into play. This case on the bottom here is pretty interesting. That was a med-mal case I did a few years ago, in which the person the patient actually died because the nurse ended up putting the endotracheal tube, the ET tube, down the patient's esophagus, causing the patient to suffocate. And what happened was there was a code blue that was called, and the nurse, and these are entries from the nurse's progress notes. The nurse went back into the records, and as you can see, we had some modifications, right, to the exact time of code blue, which was very important in this matter. So I was called upon to determine if I was able to decipher the times that appeared in the overwritings, and I was, based on number 1, using my video spectral comparator, right, which I mentioned earlier, and the use of another piece of equipment that we use, which is called the ESDA, which is the electrostatic detection apparatus, which picks up indentations embedded into paper fibers. So, for instance, if you had a notebook and then you were pressing with your writing instrument on that piece of paper, well, I could actually, depending on environmental conditions, I could actually decipher several pages down what you wrote on the initial page, which really is important in this case because based on the VSC and ESDA results, I was able to decipher exactly what the times were. which were 1210, 1240, and then 1235, right? So she had went back there into the progress notes and started altering the times to coincide with the testimony of the people that were actually present during the code blue. And long story short, we were able to, I was able to demonstrate this to the jury. They had an expert, but the jury believed me. And I was able to convince the jury, and we won the case. And it was a very substantial case, one of the biggest med mal cases there. I think it was over $7 million in damages to the family, and that was the end of it. So, so you know, besides doing you know, wills, trusts, and deeds, I could also do medical records as well, and those are some of the stuff that I perform. Some famous cases that involve questioned documents, and you guys have probably heard of these. The Lindbergh kidnapping case in 1932 was a very big case back in that time when little Charles Lindbergh was kidnapped, and a man by the name of Bruno Hauptmann was indicted and charged with the murder. So the ransom letter was actually compared with Mr. Hauptmann's writings, and several document examiners, including Mr. Osborne, who I mentioned earlier, testified in that case, and they were successful in convicting Mr. Hauptmann. The Howard Hughes will, back in 1976, that was a really interesting story where a person by the name of Melvin Dumar said that he was driving along a deserted freeway in Nevada, had picked up a gentleman, found out it was Howard Hughes, and when Hughes died, produced this will. And subsequently, you know, they did an analysis of this will and determined it was a forgery. The last one there is the Hitler diaries, which was really, in 1983, which was really an interesting case. Of volumes of these documents purportedly prepared by Hitler surfaced. A news agency at the time bought these journals, I think for like $6 million back in the day. They had them authenticated by someone in Europe, but it ended up that these diaries were actually fraudulent. They were forgeries, and not even good ones either. Not only were the writings off, but they actually conducted paper analysis and ink analysis, and both were found to be inconsistent with the paper and ink available during the time period. So, so by the way, that's another thing that I also could do is invasive testing on inks to determine if the ink compositions are consistent or not, and some you know, basic testing and examinations on paper. But in the Hitler diaries, paper, ink, and handwriting all came to play in determining that these diaries were forgeries indeed. So the premise of handwriting identification. So this is basically the nuts and bolts of the standards that we use. There's three of them. Number one, no two individuals can produce exactly the same writing, right? Just like a fingerprint is, you know, no two fingerprints are ever exactly alike. No two individual writings have ever been found to be exactly alike, all right? Now, if they are exactly alike, you know, then we're dealing with something else, a couple things. Number one, if they're exactly identical with one another, we're looking at either a copy or paste situation where a person takes a signature, either electronically or physically, you know, just cuts it out and places that signature onto a document, right? And that could be, like I said, it could be electronically, or it could be, you know, with the advent of technology, it's very easy to do that nowadays. And some of the ones that I've seen now are getting really good using Adobe Photoshop. So, so it's taken it to another level. The other method, if they're exactly identical, would be that it's basically traced. It's a tracing in which somebody takes a model signature, right? and using basically like a light box, right? Using transmitted light, they take that signature and they basically outline it. It's more of a, so that's more of a drawing process than a writing process. And when you look at a signature that has been traced microscopically, you could immediately tell that it's not naturally prepared like a genuine signature would be, right? So when you write your name or your signature, usually you don't think about it. It's a subconscious act, and it's habitual, and you write it very quickly, right, without really thinking about the construction of letter forms. Really, it's muscle memory. Well, when you're trying to trace a signature, it's more of a drawing process. So therefore, the end result is going to be that the signature, the attempt of the signature, is going to be more slow, deliberate. It's more or less going to have hesitation marks. It might have pen lifts, and it's certainly going to have abrupt changes in line direction because of the uncertainty, right, of the individual of the writing, because it's not known to them. A perfect forgery is really non-existent because, number one, a person has to eliminate all their natural writing habits, right? And know all those individual writing nuances. And then number two, they have to adopt the person's signature that they're trying to forge, at the same time disregarding their own writing habits into the writings. So it's this conflict of writings that make it really difficult for writers to actually execute a perfect forgery. And so the number three thing too, if it's exactly the same writing, is you're dealing with perhaps a rubber stamp. But when you're looking at names that are produced by a rubber stamp, you could certainly tell immediately that they don't have the natural shading that a natural signature would possess. And also a good indication would be the beginning and ending strokes on a rubber stamp are usually blunt, and on natural signatures, you usually start the pen flowing. So there's that sort of that tapered, flourishing sort of look, right, to your signature, which is absent of, like I said, of a stamp signature. So those would be the three areas where they could be exactly identical, right? The second component of handwriting identification is that an individual cannot exactly reproduce his or her own handwriting due to natural writing variation. And I actually have an example of that, which I'll share with you in the next slide. But natural variations are natural deviations that a person repeats in their own handwriting. And everybody has it. So if you were to write your signature 1,000 times, I could guarantee you that no two signatures will ever be exactly alike. They will be consistent with one another. However, they won't be exactly identical. And then the third thing here is that a person is only able to write at the skill level that they're accustomed to writing, which means the uniformity, proficiency, and consistency. So a person could write below their skill ability, but you could never exceed it, right? So the very first thing that I do when I compare writings side by side, the very first question I ask myself is, does this person possess the skill level to have executed this writings or this forgery or this writing that I'm comparing? And and that's which is really important if we're using this premise here, because you're going to immediately know whether they possess that skill level or not. So here's an example. So this person signed this signature consecutively, and if you look at it pictorially, you can see that it looks the same, right? They almost look identical. However, I could tell you that they're not identical. And the way I do that is I overlay a transparent grid, right? These are quadrilateral squares. But once you lay the grid over and do your comparisons, you can certainly see that they don't align with one another exactly, right? They are definitely consistent with one another. But when you start comparing it, in terms of its line position within the grid, you could see that they are just different. So this is a good way to illustrate when I'm doing a court presentation that these signatures, although consistent, are absolutely not exactly alike. So one of the things I teach these verifiers, or one of the things I use every day, is what's called the scientific methodology, right? It's based on it's verifiable through observation and experience. And it involves careful observation, applying skepticism, right? Leaving that cognitive bias out the door, which could be a challenge for some people. And then coming up with some kind of opinion based on the data that has been analyzed. And the methodology that I apply is called the, well, here's the scientific methodology, but I'm going to go to this next slide. The methodology that I apply is called the Acev Method, which stands for Analyze, Compare, Evaluate, and Verify. And this methodology is very important. It's been around for a very long time, since the late 50s. It was actually developed by a handwriting expert, a document examiner, with the Royal Canadian Mountain Police. And he wanted to come up with an idea, a method in terms of, comparing two items, right? How do you compare two items? And he wanted to come up with a methodology that would enable him to do that. Thus the Acev was born. And I use it every day. The election judges, they're not aware that they're actually even using the process until I tell them. And then they're like, oh yeah, okay, that's exactly what I do. So, whether or not they know it or not, they're using a methodology. And the scientific methodology is, important, right? As an expert, you have to be able to articulate, what you did in your analysis, step by step. And this is the way we do it. Analysis, right, begins with the analysis of the item submitted. Determine in terms of handwriting, determine if it's original. Sometimes I get originals, and sometimes I'm provided photocopies. Sometimes the originals do not exist. So I have to work with the photocopies, which can be a limitation and a challenge. Not all photocopies are, in terms of quality, the same. Not all photocopiers produce the same image quality. They're all different. So you have to weigh those on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes I get writings or photocopies that are multi-generational. They're degraded. The line quality is hard to distinguish. Are these sufficient enough for me? And I'm asking myself this. Is this sufficient enough for me to conduct an analysis? And sometimes yes, and sometimes no. You have to be able to determine, what those limitations are, right? And if you can't tell, you can't tell. So, number one, if they're naturally prepared, if it's original, if it's a photocopy, and number two, do you have enough samples or materials to compare with, right? So if I get a question signature and I only get like 3 samples to compare with, is that enough for me to say, within a reasonable degree of certainty, is that enough comparison materials to establish range of variation for that writer? Probably not. I like to have anywhere between a dozen to infinity in terms of samples. The least that I would actually work with is probably 8 to 10, and they have to be really exceptional samples for me to deal with that number. So if you don't have an adequate amount of samples to compare with, then you have to discontinue, right? You can't complete a fair and impartial analysis. Some of the things that we look at in that portion of analysis are the beginning and ending strokes, right? Where they start, where they end, baseline features. Sometimes signatures are written on top of the signature line, sometimes below the signature line, sometimes between the signature lines. So, be aware of where the baseline features are. Proportional heights and the relationships of each letter, right? We call that size and proportion. Are they proportionate with one another? The slant of the writing is very important. Do they write with a backhand slant? Do they write with a forward-hand slant? And what I do in those cases, I actually measure those angles, and you could certainly do it with a protractor, but I have a special measuring device which I use to measure slant deviations, which makes it a lot easier in assessing. Spacing, right? Is the spacing consistent? And line quality. Is the writings spontaneously prepared, right? Are they naturally prepared versus writings that are, slow and tremulous and full of pen lifts, hesitation marks, things of that nature, right? So you have to go through this internal mental checklist in your head and then determine number one, suitability. So you're looking at all these components and features. And here are some of the definitions I go with over, like what do these words mean? These are pretty basic. Obviously, the beginning or entry strokes are the initial writings, the writing movements at the start of a letter or word. Where they begin and the location varies greatly among each writer, and that's absolutely true. Slant is the angle of the handwriting strokes away from the horizontal position at 0 degrees. At least that's the way I measure it. So if I had a protractor here, right, and it was at 0 degrees, that's kind of like my baseline. And a slant value which is larger than 90 degrees when measured and counterclockwise would be a backhand slant, and forward-hand slant would be anything lesser than that 90-degree angle. Size and proportion, defined as a part or number considered a comparative relationship to a whole. Spacing, right, between successive words and letters or lines. Baseline is that ruled or imaginary line upon which the writing rests, which I talked about earlier. And also line quality, right, which is very important, which goes into fluency, naturally prepared versus tremulous. One of the other things too that we also take into consideration is writing pressure. And this is very important, but the problem is, can you determine writing pressure on photocopies? Probably not. You more than likely need the originals to establish the amount of force in which the writing instrument is applied to the paper. And some people write heavy-handed, some people write very light, where it's almost unreadable, and some people write in between both. So writing pressure absolutely comes into play if you have original documents to compare with, and we have to look at those microscopically, by the way. And not all writing instruments too can apply that force, right? So if you had a ballpoint pen versus, let's say, a fiber-tipped pen, it's going to produce a different type of pressure. So can you compare that? Probably not. So you got to make sure again that you compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. Tremor is a big one. And usually when I see writing in tremors, it can mean a couple things. Number one, it could be based on a sort of a degenerative type of disorder, right? Such as Alzheimer's. It could be, dementia. It could be any type of illness, illness that somebody is suffering. It also could be caused by this writing surface, right? Are you writing on a smooth surface versus an irregular writing surface? It could be caused by someone under the influence of either drugs or alcohol, right? It could be caused by someone wearing gloves in the wintertime versus not wearing gloves. I actually had a case once where the writing was so tremulous, but I found out that the writing was conducted on a train. So can you conduct proper analysis when you have those types of writings, and sometimes yes and sometimes no. What you want to do is make sure that if you do have something like that, is to ensure that you have comparable writing samples, right, to compare with in like conditions. I mean, for instance, if a person signed on an irregular surface and you wanted to get writing samples from them, you probably want them to write on the same type of surface. If they're writing on a train, right, you probably want them to write on the train standing up. So you're trying to replicate. Forensic science is all about replication and duplicating. So you want to try to get as close as to the original event as possible. Sometimes that's not possible. And if so, then you have to chalk that up to perhaps a limitation in your examination. Diacritics, you guys know what that is. That's a mark that's added to a letter or a basic glyph, which changes the sound value. So for instance, I have the word sake, where you have that glyph on there at the end of the E. Be aware of those types of characteristics, as well as a tittle, right, which is the form of a dot or a lowercase I or J. And sometimes, writers, it might be original writing and they might sometimes forget to dot their I or cross their T. Does that necessarily mean that it's a forgery? No. If 95% of the signature is an agreement and you have a dot, you have an I in which the dot is not present, you're probably not gonna, I personally would probably not disregard that, and say, okay, it's a forgery based on that. No. It could be what's called an accidental variation. It's something that the person does, it occurs, but it's just simply not represented in the sample pool that you're examining from, right? So you have to take that into consideration as well. Patching and retracing are usually associated with signatures that have been forged in what we call simulations. You see this a lot with someone trying to forge a signature. They go back, they retouch it, they add features, they take out features, defective portions of writing strokes, and in some cases retrace or go over another stroke. So you have to take that into consideration as well. Retracing in itself, as a standalone, I wouldn't put a whole lot of emphasis unless you see a combination of patching and retracing, but certain letters require you to retrace, right? So you just have to, use your experience and skill set to determine whether or not the retracing is natural or if it's dubious, right? If there's an alternative motive there. So here's some examples I give, and I'm gonna probably switch over and start talking about the Tiger King here pretty soon. So the type of writings, up here we have John Quigley. One of the things I tell people, one of the things people ask me is, can you compare printing with cursive script writing? And the answer to that is no. So if you get a signature that's printed and the samples, that's in script or handwriting, right? And the sample signatures that you're getting are in printing, you can't compare that. They're two different types of elements. I can tell you that some people use a combination of printing and script writing when they do their signatures. And I have identified on a few individual cases, writers that do that. And what you have to have are, you got to have a combination of both sets of writings, and those letter formations have to be unique enough to say, within a reasonable degree of certainty, that they are unique to that person, right? And nobody else. So it is possible, but if you do get something like that, and I tell these judges, then obviously you're not going to pass that signature. Again, speed of the writing, is it, and you can't tell by this slide, if it's slow and deliberate versus spontaneously prepared. On the bottom of there, you have spacing where that red circle is there. And, I told the cast, listen, yeah, that's a spacing difference, But pictorially, looking at, 95% of that signature, would you disregard it? And I probably wouldn't. I would probably chalk that up to maybe an accidental variation, since everything else looks in agreement, right? Overall size and proportion, again, you can see the signature on the right, size of letters are certainly of the V and the B are much, much larger than the ones on the left. And and on the bottom there, the position of the signature in terms of the baseline, as I mentioned before, you can see there its position. One's canted to the right, and the other one's pretty much vertical. And spelling and punctuation. I see this a lot in writings where they actually misspell the name, which is a clue. You should have, you should definitely know how to spell your name. If you see something like this and other, inconsistencies, it's definitely more or less a forgery. All right. So, so I'm gonna switch it over now to a presentation on the Tiger King, and let's see if this works, because I'm not sure if it is going to work, but let's see if it does. All right, so let me see here. Oh, let me go back. How do I start slideshow on this presentation right here? Oh. Let's see here. I had it all keyed up, slideshow. I think that's it right there. And can I do that? Will that do it like that? Let me see. Let me move this over here. See if I can get it in this box. Can you guys see that?
We're still seeing the writing characteristics page. Oh, it's
you are?
now.
Okay. So so let me do this. Let me get out of the screen share. So let me stop share, right? So does anybody have any questions so far? I could open it up and then we'll go through the case study. But does anybody have any questions in terms of what I just presented?
Yeah, we do have some questions.
Okay.
Matthew wanted to know, he said he was here taking notes with the Apple Pencil on an iPad.
Yeah.
And he was wondering, have you ever worked with electronic handwriting? And like,
yes.
what special considerations does that raise?
Very, very good question. And this came up a lot during the election, because when they're doing these comparisons, guess what they're using? They're using your DMV signature. And I could tell you that 99.9% of those signatures are electronic. And electronic signatures actually pose a limitation. Number one, it's digitalized. It's not naturally prepared like it would be with a pen, right? And number two, you're signing usually with a stylus or your finger. So there's going to be electronic signatures pose an issue, and it's something that each state really needs to address in terms of the quality to compare with. But using that signature alone to make a comparison is dangerous. And that's why, at least for Colorado and some other states, they use, 3 to 4 other comparison signatures to look at based on your voter history. So they extract those signatures from your prior voting history, right? And then they use those for comparison purposes, but they also use the DMV one, as a sample. But on its own, I would be very careful, very reluctant actually, to actually use those in my own examinations, just because, of the nature of them. But that's a really good question, because it is coming up a lot. No two signature pads are created equal. I could tell you that Apple signature pads quality is fabulous. There's some that are just bad. So it really depends on the system, on the software system that's actually being used. Good question, though. Very good question. Yeah. Any others?
Yeah, Mike had one. He was asking about a factor in the John Bonet ransom note. What was the factor you were talking about, Mike? Are you still there? I'm sure we all have questions about the
Sure.
John Bonet ransom note. Did you have any?
Yeah, at that particular point, it was relating to the literacy level uh, comparisons, but
Yeah.
I know that there was quite a bit of hair pulling and teeth gnashing over that note, and I was wondering how that ever shook out and if you were confident.
Yeah, so I did work on that case. I will tell you that that there were 6 or 7 of us that actually worked that case. And obviously we know that the case is still unsolved today. So we certainly know that the opinions that each expert opined to was literally split in the middle, which usually doesn't happen, if experts are trained alike. But in John Bonet, it was a little bit more difficult. I did look at that. There were some limitations to it, to the analysis. There was a faction that said that Patsy did it, and there was a faction that said she didn't do it. So, where do you go from there, right? And they all make good points, but in that particular case, there are certainly limitations. Number one, there is no doubt that those writings were actually disguised. There was an attempt to distort the writings appearing on the 3-page ransom letter. I would say that in my opinion, most of the natural writing, at least some of the natural writing, usually comes out at the end, because in the first 2 sets of pages, you're really focused about, changing certain letters and letter forms. By the end of the 3rd page, right? But by the time you get to the 3rd page, sometimes your natural writing starts to come out because you're just kind of exhausted, right? And you don't remember what you're doing in the first 2 pages. So if you're going to see any natural writing, I would definitely focus on the 3rd page of the writings. So I mean, and plus, and then number 2, you're dealing with block letters, right? Block letters are and we call that copybook form. It's very, very difficult to identify that type of lettering because, as you recall, when you're in grade school, you learn a copybook form, right? Of how you do your A's, your B's, and it's uniform, pretty much. And in those writings, we have a lot of copybook letter forms, so individual uniqueness in writings is going to be very limited. However, I mean, still, it can be identifiable if you have, enough comparable, adequate, sufficient samples, right? But on the surface, generally speaking, it's very difficult to compare with. So, but that was a tough one. I know, that there were 2 different factions of opinions, and there's still today a debate as to whether she did it or not.
Oh, those letters were actually written like in copy block, like you were saying?
Yeah, I think the majority of them were, yeah, if not 99% of them, yeah.
So yeah, you wouldn't have a lot of probably sample material from.
It'd be very hard, yeah. So that coupled with the deliberate attempt to try to change or disguise writings, that becomes a limitation.
Interesting. Suzanne asked, can you tell whether the writer is a man or a woman? How about age?
That is interesting. Man or woman is very difficult because I thought sometimes I would do mine, and I've looked at thousands of cases. I've actually had writings where I thought it was a woman and it ended up being male. So personally speaking, I mean, I wouldn't bet money on it like 100%, because I've seen it personally. I mean, there are distinguishing characteristics, right, of female versus male, but scientifically speaking, I would say probably not. I would be very careful, to make that distinguish the 2. What was the second question?
How about age? Did you tell
Sometimes, yeah. So that's a really good question, because in my trainings with the election judges, what we're seeing now are writings from millennials, and what's happening is a lot of these writings from millennials are very indistinguishable, meaning that it's very hard to decipher what the hell they're writing, because they're not really being taught how to handwrite anymore. Matter of fact, there's some schools that are eliminating script writing.
Right.
So the problem is going to become eventually, okay, we got a whole new generation of youngsters that are not writing as much because of technology. What's going to happen in the next 20 years? What are we going to see? So right now, I can tell you that it's becoming a challenge. And if I see writings like that, I'm usually able to determine if they're a millennial or not. And in some cases, I can distinguish age because in some writings, where people are, that were born in like the 20s and 30s and sometimes 40s, have a very distinct style of writing system that they were taught, and they still write like that. And it's a system that's no longer taught. So certainly you could tell, when those writings occur versus more modern types of writing, like, Danilian, Zaner-Bloser methods, which are widely taught today.
I would think you would be able to tell in some of the language used too.
Absolutely, and that gets into the linguistics. I don't do linguistics, but there are experts out there that actually make their living doing forensic linguistics.
ZJ asked, are border agents handwriting on fake passports?
No. So what they're trained to do is what they do is they take the passport, and they use the comparison. Remember, I talked about this device called a video spectral comparator. So these border agents actually have these devices at the gates. And so what they're going to do is they're going to take that passport and they're going to subject it to all sorts of security feature analysis using the video spectral comparator, looking for security fibers, security inks, holograms, things of that nature, which is going to be, which the VSC, the specific VSC unit will be able to distinguish very, very rapidly.
Jeff had a question, and I had the same one. Isn't it common for a person's signature to change or evolve over time? I know mine certainly 25 years ago isn't what. So how do you take that into account if somebody's saying she signed this 25 years ago and
Sure.
I don't know, how do you
The only way to do that, a proper analysis, is to get comparative samples, comparable samples from the same time period. What we're seeing in elections are signatures now that they're doing these side-by-side comparisons, and the signatures are 20 years difference, right? And they might have been inflicted with a some kind of disease, a debilitating disease, that has caused them to write a different way. So can you do those types of comparisons? No. So what they have to do is send that signature out and get it cured. They need an updated sample from that person so they could do the proper comparison. So same thing with me. I'm not going to compare a signature that, from 20 or 30 years ago, right? That if I don't have the proper signature to compare with, or the proper writing samples. That's dangerous because writing does change over time based on different circumstances, and some people have different writing styles. I've known people that have 3 different signature styles. So, so you got to be aware of that.
Yeah, I was absolutely thinking that I can look at some of my signatures over time and they're vastly different.
Right. And signatures, like when you go sign a check at a grocery store, it's a scribble, right? I mean, versus, let's say, a signature, if you were going to sign your last will and testament, it's going to be more formal, right? Mm-hmm. So can you compare the scribbled check signature, even though for the same person, with the formal signature of the will? No. Again, you have to compare apples to apples.
So here's a scenario. If somebody said they were forced to write something under duress, like a suicide note
Yes, yes.
or a will or something, what could you look for in that to see that they were telling the truth, that they didn't really write that, or they wrote it under
Who
duress?
asked that question? That's actually a really unique question, because I actually had a case like that. It was a home invasion. The couple was an elderly couple. They were bound and tied up. And the man, the guy that was robbing them, forced them to write checks with him, forced them to write checks. And what he did was he had cashed those checks, right, after he had killed the people, this poor couple. He actually murdered them. And so the question then became, okay, they had these checks, were they, can you tell if they were, if they were forced to write these, to produce these writings? And I was able to determine within a reasonable degree of certainty that they were, based on exemplar checks from the same time period, right? I could tell that they weren't natural. They were tremulous. They were erratic. So I could tell immediately that it wasn't naturally prepared. So yes, you can.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm going to have to use that.
No, but that actually derived. It's very rare that even comes up, but it is possible if you have sufficient standards to compare with from the same time period, and knowing that they didn't suffer from any illness or ailment that could have prevented them, that could have made them sign, erratically. So you got to, right? The more information that you have about the writer conditions, the writer's condition, the more that you can make a more reasonable degree of opinion.
Have you ever had that come up in a suicide situation where somebody said, I don't think my grandfather committed suicide? Or
Right. Yeah, I've encountered a lot of those. And most of the times, it's the family. They can't, they can't comprehend that someone they love, took their own life. So there's this doubt. And it's, and that's where I come into play, because they're doubting that, hey, you know what, there's no way, Jim killed himself. He had everything to live for. And, so I've had several of those.
how about the dying victim who scrawls the initials of their killer on the wall? Or supposedly, what if the killer was setting somebody up?
I've never, so I've never had that, but I did do an in-depth study on the, do you remember McDonald, the Green Beret guy? That,
Jeff, yeah.
Fatal Vision was the book.
Yeah, John McDonald or
Yeah,
Jeffrey.
yeah, I did my thesis on that, and which he did sort of the same thing. He wrote on the walls, pig, just like the Tate murders, right?
Right.
Can you distinguish writings, like that? That would be very extremely difficult. Number one, from a sample issue, right? And number two, yeah, because you would have to obtain samples, right, using the same method, trying to replicate or reproduce it. That's not going to happen. So that's going to be probably not. It's going to be very difficult unless there's some rather unique feature that only that writer does in their writings that could be absolutely associated with them.
Well, okay. Now I knew this would come up. Do you ever get into identifying? No, wait, I missed one. Handwriting analysis and personality. Is that true that you can evaluate a person's personality based upon their handwriting?
So let me. Okay, that's a good one. And I'm trying to figure out how do I start my power slideshow. Do you know how to start? Let me do the share screen.
Okay.
Can you guys see that?
Yeah. Yep. I see it.
All right.
Yay.
So the question then becomes, you're asking me, about how do I do the, oh, here, right here. Hello. slideshow. Boom, got it. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, so let's go to that. I'm gonna tell you why. Right here. Boom. That's called graphology. So, in this particular case, the answer to your question is no. It's the theory or practice for inferring that a person's character, disposition from their handwriting, right? You could assess personality based on the characteristics of their handwriting. So I refer to this is a pseudoscience for me. I could tell you that most reputable handwriting experts here in America, at least, and most of the world, do not practice graphology because of that. There's just no scientific data to support that the way you cross your T or the way you make your ovals or the roundness or of your O's, that you're a happy gregarious person. There's just no data to support that. No true scientific information, right? Therefore, I don't use it. A lot of my colleagues don't use it, but I could tell you that in Europe, in a lot of parts of Europe, it's more widely accepted because graphology, number one, I think Europeans in general are just, they've been doing everything first for a long time, and graphology is one of them. It's been around for a very long time. And a lot of these examiners actually sometimes incorporate, graphology into their examinations. But I could tell you that, I don't do it, but some do. I just don't do it, myself. So, yeah.
I do
I
know
hope that answered that question.
Yeah. Have you ever gotten into identifying typewriters or?
Good one. So back in the day, I was actually around when typewriters were still being utilized. Now it's more of it's an artifact now. It's something you don't see a lot anymore. But back in the day, you could certainly analyze type machines because type bars obviously through time, natural wear and tear, the typesets become distinguishable, right? In terms of missing letter forms, they become broken or whatever. So yes, back in the day we were able to make those identifications. If we had a typewriter, a suspect typewriter to compare with. Today, I could say it's very difficult. We're not dealing with typewriters. We're dealing with computer-generated documents that are usually created with PDF, Adobe, Word. That takes it to a different level. So in some cases, yes, but you're going to have to deal with mostly with a computer forensic specialist that actually deals with that on a more consistent basis. So they're extracting the materials. So let's say you had a PDF, right? You're trying to determine, if it's, the authenticity of it. So they could take that, look at the properties, right, of that creation of that document on the back end and do a forensic analysis on that.
Interesting. So many ways to commit forgery these days.
Yes, it's getting better too. I mean, it's getting more difficult.
Yeah. ZJ had one question. Have you ever analyzed gang graffiti to ID a killer?
Yes, LAPD did that a lot. I mean, matter of fact, they actually monitor gang graffiti in terms, because there's a lot of information that could be derived from graffiti, and they actually have, detectives and people that actually study that. But graffiti can be identifiable by the particular artist or writer. Again, a lot of those writings, art, has a signature, right? A signature contained within it that's unique to that artist. Just like, a Rembrandt or a Picasso or a Gris or a Modigliani, right? They have a certain way of you know, stylistically and artistically, number one, and number two, the way they, you know, the way they execute their signatures, right? So it can be identifiable, to answer your question.
Right? I think that's all the current questions. So let's get to the Tiger King.
Okay. So what do you see with this? Do you see the whole screen or just a portion of the screen?
Right now, oh,
What's that say? Oh, sorry. Can you see the whole screen? Because I see something.
yeah, that
We're
we
seeing
see
your
the
whole screen.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good. By the way, I wanted to show you this real quick. This device, this is the indented writing device. This is in my lab. This is the device that was actually developed by a company in England called Foster and Freeman. And this device was actually accidentally discovered. They wanted a device that would actually pick up latent fingerprints, right? A device that would pick up fingerprints. Latent meaning invisible. So they divide a indentation machine. But what they found was that not only did it pick up fingerprints, but this device actually picked up indented writings on papers. So this is the device I'm telling you about that actually could pick up indented writings depending on, you know, certain environmental conditions, right? But I've been able to pick up indentations, you know, 8 to 10 sheets down. So, you know, so this is a very cool machine to use when you're doing those types of, you know, like med mal cases, you know, those types of cases. It comes in really handy. But I wanted to show you guys that. So let me go to the Tiger King. There we go. So I was called a few months ago to be a part of this. And as you guys, I don't know how many of you have watched this, but it's a, you know, docu-series on Netflix that was really was made famous because of COVID. I mean, everybody was basically staying home, and guess what? Tiger King was at the right place at the right time, and it exploded. It basically focuses on two individuals. Of course, on the left we have Joe Maldonado, otherwise known as Joe Exotic, and to the right we have Carol Baskin, and you probably have seen her recently on Dancing with the Stars, which was just so anyway. So she was on that, but it basically focuses on these two individuals. So, and it also focuses on a person by the name of Don Lewis, right? So who was Lewis? Well, Lewis was the husband of Carol Baskin. They married on October 10th, 1991, and Lewis mysteriously disappeared on August 18th of 1997. And on just recently, he was, I think, was legally declared dead. Actually, I believe that date's wrong. I think it was 1999. I don't think I have that correct. But he was legally declared dead, so nobody knew he's where he was or what happened to him at the time of his disappearance. You know, he had a net worth of about $5 million. You know, so at the time of his death, you know, the money was still there. He didn't take it. He didn't take it with him. You know, the theory was from Carol that he intentionally wanted to disappear. You know, but that didn't really make any sense because, or doesn't make any sense because, you know, you would think if you disappeared, right, you would take some money with you, but no money was ever withdrawn. His credit cards were never used. He just completely went off the grid. So, you know, that was a little suspicious. So what happened was I was asked to look at a couple of documents, primarily the signature belonging to Mr. Lewis. As you can see here, this was the marriage record certificate when they got married, right? They were married in '91. And as you can see, this is really important here because as you can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the red has his signature, right? Jack Lewis. This is an authentic signature. This is not in question. This is this is a known sample of his legitimate signature. And of course, you have Carol's here as well. And what's really important too is this stamp, which I have designated with this arrow here, right? It's a stamp, you know, it's an official county stamp. You know, it was probably wet ink, but this stamp is going to be important as well as I go through this analysis. So we have the known writing, the known signature of Lewis, right, on their marriage certificate. So that was provided to me. As was this last durable power of attorney right here, right, as you see here, and which was actually given to me. I believe that was a known as well. And his last will and testament, which we have circled here as well, right? So I digress. These were both signatures that were given to me as question. So they provided this last will and testament of Jack Lewis, right? And also this POA, right? So these were both questionable at the time. And here they are juxtaposed. On the top, I have the marriage certificate. On the bottom, I have, you know, the question signature of his. And on the bottom here, I've had the will. So this is the POA, and then the question will on the bottom here, right? So I was asked to compare K1 with Q1s, and here's what happened. What I did was, and I think I showed you earlier, remember we were talking about signatures being exact? So what I did was I overlaid that quadrilateral grid over it. And as you can see, when I did that, we have, and as you can see here, you know, I have them marked with the arrows. We have features that are identical to one another, meaning that, again, remember the three things that I talked to you guys about? The only way that happens is a cut and paste, a stamp, or a tracing. Three identical signatures, right, of Jack Lewis. And I could demonstrate that by overlaying the grid. So we have agreement, wherever one of these are pointed, we have exact agreement where they're located within each one of these quadrilateral squares, which is impossible, folks, to be like this and know exactly like this. But what's really interesting in the Q1 too is look at where I have circled here in this arrow. So remember I was talking about that stamp right on the marriage certificate. Well, what happened was when they I think they either traced that or I believe the middle one was traced, but it could have possibly been cut and pasted. What they did was where this starts to get really messy at the end of Lewis is where this notary stamp was positioned, right? You could see that where this was. So what happened was, because of the interference of this, right, they took it out and then they had to improvise, the rest of the signature. And as you can see, if you look at it pictorially, it's just really inconsistent. It doesn't look as naturally prepared as the rest of it, right? Even though it's a forgery, but it just doesn't look fluid. Obviously, it's very interesting, that it actually occurs in the exact same location where this notary stamp, is positioned. So I was able to demonstrate that these were identical, and I took it one step further and overlaid them together. So as you can see from this demonstration, you can see that they're exactly the same signature. But when you get to here, right, when we get to the last portion where the improvisation is, you can see that they actually, improvised that last portion of it, right? Because they didn't have it. So you can see everything is absolutely in alignment and in agreement. And remember, the premise of one of the fundamental premises of handwriting identification is no two signatures are ever going to be exactly alike. So, we do have, some divergences here, but I expect to see that because, one of the reasons I think it is a tracing is because, when you're tracing the outline, right, it's not going to be, it might not be exactly like the loop in this age, but I could tell you proportionately, it's going to be very consistent. Here, it's a little longer, but you can see that everything else is in agreement. So it's my opinion that it's more likely a tracing than it is a cut and paste. But you wouldn't have this absolute agreement, if they were all three signatures were separately prepared. And that's it. Questions, concerns?
That was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
I do have one question.
There's a lot of questions on my. Oh, yeah, okay. I think you've asked them already. Okay.
Yeah, I went through most of those already. Kind of going back to that form blindness test.
Yeah.
And the York. Can you explain that again? Like, how is that implemented?
Sure. So the way it's implemented is you're given a certain time factor. Usually, and when I was given it, I had 30 minutes to pair. So there's 64 Yorks, and each one of them there's a pair. So there's 32 corresponding answers, right?
Oh, so you can pair them together?
Correct, right. So one York is going to be fundamentally consistent with another York. So you're supposed to compare and determine which ones are a match.
Okay.
So if you look at the first one, the first York compares, it's consistent with number 55. That would be the answer.
Okay.
Number 2 and then number 3, then yeah.
And you're given a certain amount of time?
I was given 30 minutes. I give the election judges an hour and they only get through it. They're like maybe a quarter of the way. A lot of people don't finish it.
Is there at some point you say you're not a good election judge?
I mean, you know what? We've had some people that have really struggled with the form blindness. The question then becomes, are they retrainable? Or number 2, do we need to put them in a different position besides verifying signatures?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
And then I think my last question was, how far back in history can you go to determine like paper and ink kind of samples? When did the FBI actually start collecting all that stuff? And then for something really, really old, what do you have to do?
Well, so in terms of ink analysis, there's only a couple organizations, government entities that actually have an established ink library. One of them is the IRS, has one of the most extensive ink libraries, the IRS lab. The other one is the Secret Service. They absolutely have another one. They have the other more extensive one. The FBI has one, but not as extensive as the others. And then there's no really public entity. Some ink chemists actually have their own reference files, but I'm telling you right now, when it comes to trying to determine, date of introduction of a particular type of ink, the government's not going to share that information. So it's closely held to the vest. So there is an ink library, but like I said, the government maintains that. Paper, with paper, you could certainly you could contact the paper mills. They're very helpful. I actually did a school with Mead Paper Company, and we learned all about the paper manufacturing process. But if you ever have a paper issue, just reach out to Mead or Cascale. They would be happy to help you out. I've actually had documents post-Civil War, or pre-Civil War. I was able to identify based on the type of paper that was utilized and the the watermarks that are actually contained within the paper are a good identification factor as well.
Okay, 2 more questions because I know we're over time. And thank you for staying late, everyone. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
So Mike wants to know, how confident are you with the signature verifications in the election?
Oh, I'm extremely confident. Matter of fact, I did a PBS Nova broadcast. You could probably find it online. I've done a lot of media requests on this subject. You know, I personally, I've done the research. I've personally witnessed the automation process. I know the company that actually does that provides the signature automated algorithms and software for these programs. And I could tell you that I'm 100% confident that people could vote by mail and that our system absolutely works. You know, Denver, Colorado is the gold standard when it comes to the election process. Many states reach out to us to find out how we're doing it. And a lot of those states now are adopting our protocols and systems as we speak, because, you know, because of the way we do and conduct these examinations. You know, it's 3 or 4 tiers, you know, before that signature is probably ultimately rejected. So we go out of our way to make sure that every vote counts.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't understand that it goes through the machine, the algorithms and all of that before
That's
it
just
ever
the
gets
first
to
phase.
people. Right.
Like if that gets kicked back, it goes to the evaluation judges, right, who will look at it and you know, from that tier. And if they can't make a determination, it goes to another tier. And then if they can't cure it, they're going to send it to the person to cure it.
Right. Excellent.
Well, Mark,
And-
thank you very much. This was a terrific presentation. And Lori, thank you very much, as always, for your terrific moderating.
Thank you very much, you guys. It was really fun. And if you ever have any, you know, if you ever want to know anything in forensics, you know, I'll be happy to share that. Not just handwriting, but in general, if you write a book or a novel. I have a book out there. It's called The Practical Applications of Forensic Science. And you could certainly, if you wanted to use it, you know, just let me know and I'd be happy to share it.
Thank you so much, Mark.
You bet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Have a blessed
All
day.
right.
All right.
Bye, everybody.